Hello class, this is Econ 510, Managerial Economics class. Today is April 12th, Tuesday. The class will cover the second half of Chapter 12, Monopolistic Competition. Here is the order of a video clip we are going to discuss today. 1. Monopolistic competition. 2. Conditions of a monopolistic competition. 3. Economics animation about monopolistic competition. 4. Monopolistic in microeconomics. 5. Economics animation about mergers. Here is the first video clip.
Because you already know about competition from episode 26 and monopoly from episode 27, you actually have all the information you need to analyze a monopolistically competitive market. As the name of this structure suggests, it's something of a mashup of the characteristics of a perfectly competitive market and those of a monopoly market. It's competitive, so like perfect competition, there are a large number of sellers, a large enough number so that no individual can affect the overall market. And as the large number of competitors would suggest, there's free entry and exit. Firms find no substantial barriers to entering or departing this market. But, moving in the direction of a monopoly, the monopolistic competitor's product is differentiated, albeit only slightly, from the products produced by its rivals. This product differentiation gives the monopolistically competitive firm a small amount of control over the price that it can charge. Not a lot of control, because the products are still highly similar, but a little control. Think back to the toothbrush example from episode 25. Toothbrushes are toothbrushes with small differences like angled heads or rubber grip handles or the ability to play a song to tell you how long to brush your teeth. If I, as the customer, believe that the rubber grip handle is the key to good dental health, then the rubber grip handle toothbrush manufacturer will be able to get me to pay a bit more for the product than for any other kind of toothbrush. Not too much more though, or I'll switch to a close substitute. Notice that in my toothbrush example, there's a real differentiation, where there are physical differences in the products. It is possible in this market structure to have artificial differentiation, where two products are physically identical, but through marketing, say attractive packaging or celebrity endorsements, consumers are convinced that the products are different. This couldn't happen in a perfectly competitive market because of the assumption of perfect information being available. But in a monopolistically competitive market, perfect information does not exist, and consumers can be fooled into believing that products are different by the use of advertising and marketing. In the end, as long as consumers perceive the products to be different, then the products are different. It doesn't matter whether the difference is real or artificial. So, in monopolistic competition, there are lots of competitors with highly substitutable products that have slight differences, and there's free entry and exit. What does the market look like? Well, the demand facing each producer will be a small fraction of the overall market demand, and the demand will be highly, but not perfectly, elastic. So, whereas the perfectly competitive firm's demand was horizontal, showing that they had no control over price, the monopolistically competitive firm's demand will be downward sloping, if fairly flat, showing that the firm has a small amount of control over its price. From here, you can treat the graph much as you treated the monopoly graph. With a downward sloping demand, the firm's marginal revenue will lie below its demand curve. To find the profit maximizing output and price for the firm, we need to add the marginal cost curve, determine where marginal revenue equals marginal cost to get the optimal output Q star, and then use the demand line to determine how much the firm owner can get the buyers to pay for those Q star units. Like a monopolist, a monopolistically competitive firm could make money, lose money, or break even in the short run. But like perfect competition, the picture will change in the long run. The firm will end up just breaking even over time. Why? Because not only does the firm have very little market power, remember also the assumption of free entry and exit. If a monopolistically competitive firm is making a profit in the short run, then other firms will see that profit and they will enter the industry. This will draw away some customers from the existing firm, lowering demand, and eventually the existing firm will just break even. Remember, if profits still exist, new firms continue to enter until there are no more profits to be had. What if the firm is losing money in the short run? In the long run, then, some firms will leave. Their customers will have to shift to other sellers so that the remaining firms will see their demand curves increase until such point as they can break even. At that point, exit from the industry stops. So in the long run, like a perfectly competitive firm, the profits are driven to zero. There is an important difference, though. Take a look at the two types of firms. The perfectly competitive firm in the long run always ends up operating at the most efficient point, that is, the lowest per unit cost, on the long run average total cost curve, whereas the monopolistically competitive firm always operates just shy of peak efficiency, operating at a slightly higher cost and producing fewer units. To wrap up, let's do a quick recap of this market structure as compared to perfect competition and monopoly. There are a large number of firms, more like perfect competition. With respect to the product produced, it's not identical across firms, as with perfect competition, but neither is it unique. The products are differentiated but highly similar, and therefore highly substitutable. Entry and exit are easy, which affects the ability to sustain profits. All types of firms use the marginal revenue equals marginal cost rule to maximize profit, and any firm could make money, lose money, or break even in the short run. But in the long run, only a firm with barriers to entry to protect its profits can sustain those profits. What about price and output? The result will be somewhere between the two extreme structures, producing more than a monopoly but less than a perfectly competitive market, charging less than a monopoly but more than a perfectly competitive market. Next time, Oligopoly.
Monopolistic competition is a market structure with many independent firms operating in a competitive market, where each firm sells a slightly different good or service. Monopolistic competition was first identified and discussed by American economist Edward Chamberlain and British economist Joan Robinson in the 1930s. Most high streets are populated with firms operating under monopolistic competition. The key characteristics of this market form are differentiated products, low barriers to entry and exit, a large number of independent firms. Firms can exploit their differences and make supernormal profits in the short run. Only normal profits are available in the long run as new firms enter. The market is very dynamic. Differentiation can be through design, color, distribution, quality, customer service, and staff skills and training. Firms operating under monopolistic competition dominate the high street, with common examples including restaurants, hairdressers, estate agents, and independent stores. Here we see that supernormal profits are available in the short run. In the long run, new firms enter the market, selling cheaper, better, or newer products, or they offer some other distinguishing feature. This pushes down the firm's average revenue curve and makes the curve more elastic as there are now more choices for the consumer. This provides the incentive for the firm to innovate, to keep ahead of rivals, and make supernormal profits. Despite increased choice and innovation, firms operating under conditions of monopolistic competition experience allocative inefficiency, with price being greater than marginal cost, and productive inefficiency, with average cost being above its lowest possible point. This is true in both the short and long run.
An oligopoly is a market structure where a few large firms control most of the market. If you think about a monopoly where a single entity controls the entire market, or perfect competition where there are many smaller companies selling the same goods and services, we needed to find a happy medium, something between having a store on every corner, but not having one brand that rules them all. So, oligopolies were formed. Once again, to understand how these industry structures work, it's helpful to think about an industry you are familiar with that could be an oligopoly. For our purposes here, let's say if there are 3 to 4 companies that control most of the market, it's an oligopoly. Utility companies are often set up as regional monopolies, so they don't help us. Gas stations are closer to perfect competition, so that doesn't provide much insight. Take a second and think about it. What industry in the United States has 3 to 4 companies that essentially rule the market? I bet you thought of a few. Maybe oil companies, maybe airlines, maybe public accountants. All excellent examples. For our example, let's use one we are probably all familiar with, and one that constantly shows us how oligopolies behave towards each other and customers. Mobile phone providers. So in the mobile telephone market, we really have AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and Sprint. There are others in there, Straight Talk, Cricket, US Cellular, and Boost. One of the most important things to remember about an oligopoly is that the big players are not the only players in the market. They just have a significant amount of the market share. If the 8 providers I listed above all have about 10% market share, and a few smaller companies made up the rest of the market, we wouldn't have an oligopoly. But take a guess at how much market share the top 4 providers have. What do you think? 50%? 65%? 80%? Well, AT&T and Verizon both have about 34% each, so there goes 68% of the pie. T-Mobile has about 16%, and Sprint has about 15%. That means the top 4 competitors in the mobile phone industry have 99% of the market. Now, next time you hear the Justice Department tell AT&T they can acquire Sprint, it might make more sense. And AT&T that owns Sprint would have 50% market share. Why do we care that a few big companies have so much market share? Or do we? How does it change their behavior as competitors or our behavior as consumers? First of all, think about the pricing behavior. In a monopoly, if the company raises its prices and you need
It is possible for market competition to be reduced through corporate mergers. Not all mergers are anti-competitive, though, and some are even efficiency-enhancing. Let's take a look at 3 categories of mergers. 1. Conglomerate mergers are mergers between companies with unrelated output. For example, in 1967, the Campbell's Soup Company acquired Godiva Chocolate. Did this merger affect competition in the soup market? No. Did it affect competition in the candy market? No. Conglomerate mergers do not reduce competition in either market since the products are unrelated, so the U.S. government allows them. 2. Vertical mergers are input-output mergers. This means that a firm that produces a product merges with a firm that produces a resource used in the production of that product. For example, what if that soup company acquires, say, the company that makes the cans that the soup comes in? This is actually cost-reducing, i.e. efficiency-enhancing, because among other reasons it cuts out the costs of the middleman. The soup company doesn't have to continually renegotiate contracts with the can producers. Because vertical mergers make production more cost-effective, the government typically has no problem with them. The one exception would be if a company was trying to acquire the sole producer of a resource, since that would result in a monopoly in the product market. For example, in 1999, there were two major competing bookstore chains on the East Coast, Borders and Barnes & Noble. Barnes & Noble put in a bid to acquire a book wholesaler, Ingram, but the government rejected the request because Ingram was the only major book distributor on the East Coast. Approval of the merger would leave the competitor, Borders, without a distributor, effectively driving them out of business. The government rejected this merger because of the monopoly that would result from it. 3. Horizontal mergers are mergers between companies that sell the same output. These are the mergers that undergo the greatest scrutiny by the government. If the merger doesn't noticeably alter competition in the industry, it's approved, but if it does affect competition, it is rejected. There's a big difference between two small companies, say each has a 1% market share, merging, versus two large companies, say one has 15% and the other has 25%, merging. The government uses industry concentration data to evaluate merger requests. The Herfindahl-Hirschmann index uses the sum of the squares of each firm's market share, or the 50 largest firms if there are more than 50, to measure industry concentration. For example, if the industry is a monopoly, then there's only one firm, which has 100% of the industry, so H equals 100 squared, or H equals 10,000. Thus, 10,000 represents the highest possible index number, or the highest level of industry concentration. An industry with two firms, each having 50% of the market, would have H equals 50 squared plus 50 squared, or H equals 5,000. What about an industry with 100 firms, each having 1% of the industry? Then H, the sum of the squared shares of the top 50 firms, would be 50. A Herfindahl-Hirschmann index of less than 100 indicates a highly competitive industry. An HHI below 1500 indicates unconcentrated. An HHI between 1500 and 2500 is considered moderately concentrated, and an HHI above 2500 indicates a highly concentrated industry. 2500 is the U.S. threshold for mergers. One potential weakness in using the HHI is that the index can vary based on how the applicant defines the industry in the request for merger. For example, in 1997, McDonnell Douglas and Boeing merged. You would think that, being the two largest aerospace companies in the U.S., such a merger would be rejected, but the companies argued that the applicable market was global, not just domestic, so that foreign companies constituted part of the market in question. Thus, the Federal Trade Commission said that Boeing's acquisition of McDonnell Douglas would not substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly in either defense or commercial aircraft markets, and the merger passed the industry concentration hurdle.
Before we can talk about Nash equilibrium, we need to review the idea of game theory. Game theory is the idea that the results of one or more players' decisions are based on the behaviors or choices of other players. The classical example typically used to teach game theory is the prisoner's dilemma. In the prisoner's dilemma, two crooks are caught in a burglary attempt. The police separate the two men and offer each of them the following deal: rat out your buddy and you'll be off the hook. Refuse to cooperate and you'll be punished. The catch is your punishment depends on the decision your partner made. There are four combinations of outcomes. You rat out your partner or you don't, and he has the same two choices. That gives us the following possibilities. 1. You both turn each other in. 2. You both stay quiet. 3. You turn him in, but he stays quiet. 4. He turns you in, but you stay quiet. Each of these outcomes has a different punishment. In option 1, when you both turn each other in, you each have to serve 3 years in prison. In option 2, when you both stay quiet, you both only have to serve 1 year. That sounds good, but in option 3, if your partner stays quiet and you turn him in, you don't have to serve any time, but your partner serves 5 years. The opposite is true in option 4. You serve 5 years because you stayed quiet and your partner ratted you out. What's the best option? The answer to that depends on what your partner does, just like his best answer depends on what you say. Since you can't coordinate with him, you have to anticipate, as best you can, what he might do, and use that information to determine your action. If you are certain he'll be quiet, you should be quiet too, since doing that will get you both a year. But then you think, I'm sure he'll stay quiet, and he'll have the same confidence in me, so if I turn him in and he stays quiet, he gets 5 years and I get nothing. Of course, he's thinking the same thing, and if you both act on that, you both end up serving 3 years. What to do? The process of finding the best answer to that question is the focus of game theory. That review of game theory was important because the prisoner's dilemma is the simplest scenario in which to describe Nash equilibrium. The definition of Nash equilibrium is the outcome where both or all players are assumed to know the decisions of the other players and make the best decision for themselves given the other player's decisions. Let's try and figure out the best option and the Nash equilibrium of our prisoner's dilemma situation we just described. What's the best decision?
Before we discuss game theory, let's talk about a very popular example of this idea. This example will give us something to refer back to as we learn why game theory is so important to economics. Here is our example. 2 small-time criminals are breaking into cars, stealing what they can. They are working together in the same area of town. Fortunately, they get caught and booked down at the station. The detective goes in to question them separately and offers them both the same deal. They can either confess or stay silent. Their punishment will be determined by what action they take and what action the other perp takes. Here's what could happen. A. If both perps confess, they each get 3 years. B. If both perps stay silent, they each get 1 year. C. If perp number 1 stays silent and perp number 2 confesses, perp number 2 serves no time and perp number 1 serves 10 years. D. If perp number 2 stays silent and perp number 1 confesses, perp number 1 serves no time and perp number 2 serves 10 years. So if you were perp number 1, what would you do? You could stay quiet and count on only getting 1 year, hoping your friend stays quiet as well, and you'll both only serve 1 year. But what if you admit to being involved and they admit to being involved as well? Then you'll both get 3 years. Or what if you both stay silent, but your friend admits? Then you'll get 10 years. That wouldn't be good. So maybe you should just come clean and admit your involvement. Confessing seems like the best deal, right? Well, it is if your friend stays quiet. The lesson to be learned from the prisoner's dilemma described above is how difficult it is to make an optimal decision when 2 competitors, and that's what these 2 perps are right now, can't collaborate. Typically, the economic man or woman is someone who makes decisions based on their own self-interest and chooses that which maximizes their own benefits. The entire idea behind game theory is that the result of your decision isn't known to you until you find out what your friend or competitor is going to do. So you have to make the best decision you can based on the information you have. Okay, so we know how game theory works in a fictional situation that would never really happen. But what about how game theory applies to real life? Well, we can talk about that too.
Today's lesson, we're going to examine a model for oligopoly behavior known as the Kinked demand curve model. In a previous lesson, we introduced the market structure of oligopoly and talked about how game theory and payoff matrices could be used to analyze the behavior of oligopolistic firms. You recall that an oligopoly is a market with a few dominant firms in which the outcome of any individual firm's behavior is dependent not only on that firm's behavior, but also on the behavior of its competitor. For this reason, we say that oligopolistic markets are highly interdependent. The firms in these markets are very interdependent on one another. Today we're going to be looking at the market for cellular phone plans in Switzerland. This is a market with only a couple of dominant firms, notably Swisscom and Orange. We'll be looking at the demand for Swisscom's cellular plans at a range of prices ranging from $100 to $10 per month. First, we're going to make some assumptions about oligopoly pricing behavior. So looking at the right side of the screen here, let's make a few assumptions about the behavior of oligopolists when it comes to determining their prices. For example, in the market for Swiss cellular plans, the monthly rate currently is approximately $60 per month for a cell plan, and we're going to assume that at this price of $60, Swisscom sells approximately 5,000 plans a month. So we'll put an original equilibrium price and quantity on our graph of 5,000 cell plans at a price of $60 per month. What we want to know is what will happen to the demand for Swisscom cell plans if Swisscom lowers its price, and what would happen to demand for Swisscom cell plans if Swisscom raised its price. Now, in order to determine how consumers will respond to price changes from the equilibrium price of $60, we must try to predict what Swisscom's primary competitor, Orange, will do in response to a change in price for Swisscom cell plans. So let's make some assumptions over here. We're going to assume that if Swisscom lowers its price, Orange will also lower its price. Now, why is this very likely to occur? Why would Orange lower its price in response to a decrease in price by Swisscom? Well, this has to do with oligopoly behavior. Of course, Orange's revenues and profits depend as much on the price that Swisscom charges as they do on the price that Orange charges, and vice versa. The same is true for Swisscom. The reason, therefore, that we should assume that Orange will decrease its price in response to a lower price from Swisscom is that Orange will not want to lose market share in case Swisscom decreases its price. Therefore, price decreases will be matched. Now that's going to play a very important role when we draw the demand curve that Swisscom faces. The implication here is that demand for Swisscom will be highly inelastic below $60. Why do we say demand is highly inelastic? Well, it's because we assume that the competitor Orange will also lower its price. Therefore, Swisscom cannot hope to gain a significantly larger market share by decreasing its price. What would happen, on the other hand, if Swisscom chose to raise its price? How would Orange, the primary competitor, respond to a price increase by Swisscom? That's the next question we're going to answer. If Swisscom raises its price, we should probably assume that Orange will keep its price at $60. In other words, Orange will ignore a price increase by Swisscom. Why should we make this assumption? Why would the oligopolistic firm, Orange, ignore a price increase by Swisscom? Well, this is the rational thing for Orange to do. If Swisscom's price increases, we can assume that Orange will capture much of the market share since Orange's price remains low. It is perfectly rational for Orange to ignore price increases by Swisscom and match price decreases. If Swisscom unilaterally raises its price of a monthly cell phone plan, many of Swisscom's customers will switch over to Orange. Orange will not raise its price if Swisscom does, because Orange stands to benefit from the increase in demand for its cell plans in the face of an increase in price by its competitor Swisscom. So we can say the demand for Swisscom will be highly elastic at a price above $60. By elastic, we mean that a particular percentage increase in price above $60 will result in a much larger percentage decrease in the quantity demanded due to the fact that consumers will switch over to Orange in large numbers. So we've made a couple of important assumptions about the pricing behavior of oligopolistic firms. Price decreases will be matched, price increases will be ignored. With these assumptions in mind, we can derive a demand curve for Swisscom's cellular plans. We're starting out at a price of $60. Let's look at the assumptions we've made and determine how demand will change if Swisscom lowers its price and if Swisscom raises its price. So starting with the first bullet point here, that Orange will not want to lose market share if Swisscom decreases its price. Therefore, price decreases will be matched. Demand for Swisscom will be highly inelastic below $60. This implies that if, for example, Orange lowered its price to $40, the increase in quantity demanded will be very small because we should assume that Orange, or the competitor, will also lower its price. So let's assume that the quantity demanded only grows from 5,000 to 6,000 customers following a price decrease. This means that the demand curve will be highly inelastic below a price of $60. On the other hand, if Swisscom raises its price, we should assume that Orange will keep its price at $60, and therefore demand for Swisscom will be highly elastic at a price above $60. Orange will ignore a price increase. Therefore, if Swisscom were to raise its price from $60 to $70, let's say, the quantity demanded will fall dramatically. Let's assume the quantity demanded falls from 5,000 cell plans per month to only 1,000 cell plans per month following a price increase. This means that demand is highly elastic above $60. What we end up with when we draw a demand curve based on these assumptions is what we call a kinked demand curve. You can see that at any price other than the equilibrium price of $60, demand will slope very steeply below $60. In other words, demand will be inelastic. However, demand will slope very gently above $60. Demand will be relatively elastic. Now, the slope of this demand curve is based on our assumptions of how Orange will respond to price changes by Swisscom. Price decreases will be matched in order to maintain market share, but price increases will be ignored in order to capture customers who will switch from Swisscom to Orange following an increase in price by Swisscom. So based on our assumption of the kinked demand model, we can make some predictions about how Orange and Swisscom will determine the prices for their cellular plans. We should assume that Orange will have very little incentive to lower its price for cell plans. Let me illustrate why. We want to know how would revenues be affected if Swisscom or Orange were to lower their price. I'm going to shade an area on this graph which represents total revenues at a price of $60. Swisscom must decide whether or not lowering its price will improve its total revenue. Well, let's see what happens. If Swisscom were to lower its price to $40, the quantity demanded would only grow by 1,000 units, which is a very small increase in quantity demanded. In fact, the percentage increase in quantity would only be 20%, following a 30% decrease in their price. This means that Swisscom's total revenues would actually be smaller, represented by the green rectangle, following a decrease in the price. It would not be in Swisscom's interest to lower its price to $40, since the firm's total revenues would fall, but providing more cell service would cause the firm's total costs to increase. Unequivocally, Swisscom's profits would be less at $40 than they would be at $60. Therefore, it is not in the firm's best interest to lower its price, due to the fact that the competitor will match the price decrease. So what about a price increase? Could Swisscom benefit by raising its price? Clearly that would not be the case. An increase in price from $60 to $70 would once again cause total revenues to fall. The blue rectangle represents Swisscom's total revenues at a price of $70. Swisscom's total revenues would decrease if it raised its price. Swisscom's total revenues would decrease if it lowered its price. What we see, therefore, is that there is a tendency for the price in an oligopolistic market to be very sticky, to remain steady at the equilibrium level. Oligopolists have no strong incentive to raise or lower their prices. What we end up with is a kinked demand curve, which is highly inelastic below the equilibrium price and highly elastic above the equilibrium price. Now, to complete our graph, we should add marginal revenue curves to this graph. We know that marginal revenue diminishes at twice the rate that price does. Therefore, an oligopolist will face a marginal revenue curve that is also kinked and actually has two different segments to it. What we end up with is two marginal revenue curves, one that accompanies the highly elastic range of demand and one that slopes twice as steeply as the highly inelastic range of demand. And since this demand curve and the marginal revenue curves that go with it come in two segments, there is essentially a vertical range of marginal revenue. Here we have our kinked demand and marginal revenue curves. The implication of the vertical range of marginal revenue is that even if an oligopolist's marginal costs were to increase significantly in the short run, the oligopolist's profit maximizing level of output would not change. The profit maximization rule says that firms should produce where MC equals MR. As we can see, following an increase in marginal costs, the MC equals MR quantity and price do not vary from 5,000 cell plans at a price of $60. This lesson has introduced the kinked demand curve model of oligopoly pricing. Kinked demand is based on the assumptions that we've outlined on the right here. Price decreases will always be matched in an oligopolistic market since competitors do not wish to lose market share. Therefore, demand will be highly inelastic below whatever price currently exists in the market. Price increases, however, will be ignored since the competitor, in the face of rising prices from its competitor, stands to gain a significant amount of market share by keeping its price stable at the original equilibrium. What we end up with, therefore, is a stable equilibrium in oligopolistic markets. Firms tend not to want to raise or lower their prices due to the assumptions that we've made here. And this can be illustrated on a kinked demand and marginal revenue curve, which has a vertical range of marginal revenue, implying that even as a firm's costs rise or fall in the short run, an oligopolistic firm will be very hesitant to change the level of output and the price that it charges for its products. This lesson and the previous lesson on oligopoly, in which we outlined how game theory can be used to analyze oligopoly behavior, should provide a pretty thorough toolkit for analyzing and evaluating the behavior of oligopolistic firms. Game theory and payoff matrices and the kinked demand curve model both imply that oligopolistic markets tend to achieve equilibriums at which price and quantity tend not to vary. In the game theory model, we could also analyze other behaviors such as advertising, offering discounts, or opening stores in various locations, all different decisions that oligopolistic firms must make by considering the response of their competitors and how the competitors' response will affect the firm in question's total revenues or its profits. Today's lesson is all about monopolistic competition. Today we're going to define and discuss the market structure that is monopolistic competition. We'll identify some examples of industries that are monopolistically competitive, and we'll analyze the demand, marginal revenue, and the costs of production as seen by a monopolistically competitive firm to determine the level of output and the price that will result in both the short run and the long run in a monopolistically competitive market. So in previous lessons, we have discussed two other market structures up to this point. We have learned about perfect competition, which is a market in which there are thousands of identical sellers selling a homogeneous product, in which firms are price takers, face horizontal demand curves, and earn zero economic profits due to the very low barriers to entry. On the other extreme of the spectrum of competition, we've discussed pure monopoly, a market structure in which there is a single seller selling a unique product and enjoying the benefits of high entry barriers, meaning that the firm can earn economic profits in the long run due to its price-making power. Now, monopolistic competition is actually closer to the perfectly competitive market than it is to the monopolistic market. Some of the characteristics that exist in monopolistically competitive markets include a large number of sellers selling slightly differentiated products. Now, differentiated is a term that means simply different. Unlike perfect competitors, monopolistic competitors sell products that aren't the same as every other firm. An example of this might be a restaurant that sells Mexican food. Mexican restaurants are not the same as Italian restaurants, for example, or Thai restaurants. Mexican restaurants differentiate their food by producing a certain type of food. So the restaurant industry is actually a good example of a monopolistically competitive industry. Now, another characteristic of monopolistic competition is that entry barriers exist, but are very low. It is quite easy to open a monopolistically competitive business. The costs of getting into the industry are quite low. Therefore, firms will enter the industry if economic profits exist. Now, another characteristic is that since the firms are differentiating their output slightly, each firm has some price making power. Now, this implies that each individual firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. This is in contrast to perfect competition, in which firms are price takers, and therefore each firm faces a horizontal demand curve determined by the price in the market for its product. Next, we can say that due to the low barriers to entry that exist, economic profits are unsustainable in the long run. Just like in perfect competition, if economic profits exist, firms will be attracted to the market. The demand as seen by the individual firms in the market will fall, and therefore the price that they can ultimately sell their output for will fall due to the original economic profits that may have been earned in the short run. So economic profits cannot be earned in the long run because the entry barriers are low and entry eliminates profits. Finally, we can say that due to the price-making power of monopolistic competitors, neither allocative nor productive efficiency will be achieved in the long run. So let's get into our graphical analysis of monopolistic competition. We can actually illustrate a graph for an individual firm in monopolistic competition based on some of the characteristics that we've just identified. For example, the fact that firms differentiate their products imply that they'll have some price-making power, and that the demand that each individual firm will face is downward sloping. So we can start by drawing a downward sloping demand curve. Now, this is in contrast to the perfectly elastic horizontal demand curve seen by an individual firm in perfect competition. It looks more like a monopolist demand curve. It's downward sloping, meaning that the firm can charge high prices and sell small levels of output, or can charge low prices and expect to sell very high levels of output, as we can see here. There's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded for an individual firm's output in monopolistic competition. Next, we can examine marginal revenue for a monopolistically competitive firm. Since these firms are generally going to be single price sellers, price discrimination will be very difficult under monopolistic competition due to the fact that the firms don't have a huge amount of monopoly power. So a single price seller in monopolistic competition, just like a single price monopolist, as we have shown in previous lessons, will have a marginal revenue curve that lies below its demand curve, meaning that at any level of output, the firm's marginal revenue will be lower than the price it's selling its output for. So let's draw a marginal revenue curve that is connected to demand at a level of output equal to 1, but slopes down twice as steeply as demand, due to the fact that the seller must lower its price in order to sell additional units of output. Its marginal revenue will always fall faster than the price of its good. So now we have the basic foundation for a monopolistically competitive firm diagram. We've got the demand curve, we've got the marginal revenue curve. All that's missing, of course, is our cost curves. So let's go ahead and draw a marginal cost curve. Now, marginal cost for a monopolistic competitor looks just like it does for any other firm. The shape explained by the law of diminishing marginal returns. Next, we can draw an average total cost curve. And I'm just going to go ahead and draw an ATC curve anywhere on this graph, making sure that the relationship between ATC and MC fits with everything we know about the cost that a firm faces. So once again, ATC must intersect marginal cost at its lowest point. Now what we have is a graph for a monopolistic competitor in the short run. we can show that following the profit maximization rule of produce where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, the monopolistic competitor will want to produce at a quantity where MC equals MR, which is right here. We'll call that QMC for the monopolistic competitor's quantity, and it can charge a price that corresponds with demand for that quantity of output. So just like we showed in a monopoly diagram, the price the firm will charge is found by going above the profit maximizing quantity up to the demand curve and then over to the price axis. And to determine whether or not this firm is earning economic profits, we can go up to the average total cost curve and over to the price and cost axis, and we can see that at its current level of output and price, our firm is earning economic profits equal to P minus ATC. So we have a rectangle here representing the firm's profits. So far, this looks just like a monopoly diagram, and that's exactly what it should look like. These firms are price makers. They face a downward sloping demand curve. Marginal revenue will always be less than price. And if they are successfully differentiating their products, the firm should be able to earn economic profits in the short run, as we have shown in this graph. But now is where things get a little bit different than pure monopoly, because another characteristic of monopolistic competition is that entry barriers are low and that economic profits cannot be earned in the long run. So using our diagram, we have to show that in the long run, these profits will be eliminated. So we're going to do that now. How would this look in our graph? And why would these profits be eliminated? Well, let's give an example here. Let's go back to our Mexican restaurant. Let's say that a Mexican restaurant opens in the city of Zurich, for example, where I live. Zurich doesn't have a lot of Mexican restaurants. If a Mexican restaurant opened here, I can't help but think that due to its highly differentiated product, the restaurant might actually earn economic profits. But this is a market in which the entry barriers are very low. If one Mexican restaurant came in and started earning economic profits, as we see here, it's one of hundreds of restaurants in the city, so it's not a pure monopolist. It's providing food just like all the other restaurants, but that particular type of food is earning at large economic profits. So we would expect that other restaurants would start making Mexican food, and as they did, the demand for this restaurant's meals would start to decrease. So let's show what happens when new firms enter the market for Mexican food. We can expect that this demand and marginal revenue will no longer be enjoyed. There will be a lower level of demand for our individual firm here due to the fact that there is more competition in the market for Mexican food. So I'm going to clean up this graph a little bit, get rid of our original demand curve, and show what happens when demand decreases, and we'll find our new equilibrium level of output and price following the lower level of demand that occurs as new firms enter this market. So here we are, we've got the firm's costs, and we can expect that when profits were being earned, new firms were attracted to the market. And what happens now? There are more substitutes in the Mexican food market in Zurich, Switzerland. If there are more substitutes, then demand will decrease for this individual restaurant's meals, and it will become more elastic. The number of substitutes is the primary determinant of price elasticity of demand. As there become more substitutes for Mexican meals, demand will decrease and it will flatten out compared to the original level of demand. Along with demand, marginal revenue will decrease as well. Marginal revenue and demand are equal at a level of output of 1. Therefore, the marginal revenue curve shifts to the left and downwards and becomes flatter. We now have a new level of demand. We'll call this D1, and marginal revenue, we'll call that MR1, that is lower than the original level of demand. How do I know this demand is lower than the original level? Well, because as we can see, there are no longer any economic profits that are being earned. It's now impossible for a monopolistic competitor to earn economic profits. Let me show you why. The firm will want to continue to produce at the quantity where MC equals MR. This is the profit maximizing level of output. We can actually see that that is now at a slightly lower quantity because we left our dot behind from the original MR curve. So the quantity that the individual restaurant will produce has decreased. We'll call this QMC1. At the new quantity, due to the lower level of demand, the price that the restaurant can sell its meals for has decreased as well. There's more competition, and consumers are now more responsive to this restaurant's prices because there are more substitutes. So the price that the restaurant can sell for has also decreased. We can actually see that before the original price was up here at P1, now we have a price down here at P2. The decrease in demand for the individual restaurant's meals causes the restaurant to produce a smaller quantity and charge a lower price. Next, we want to determine whether or not a restaurant is still earning economic profits. And as we can see, it is not. Because at this price, let's just zoom in here, put a big red dot there, we can see that the price equals the average total cost. So we can look over here and we actually see that ATC equals price in the long run due to the entrance of new firms. If price equals average total cost, then essentially there are zero economic profits. And that fits with our characteristics of monopolistic competition. Economic profits cannot be earned in the long run. So how do we draw this graph to make sure we always show that zero economic profits will be earned in the long run in monopolistic competition? Well, look closely at what we've done here. We've shown that in the long run, the entrance of firms will assure that if profits are earned, they will be eliminated. This restaurant's demand decreased until it is tangent to the ATC curve. So there actually has to be a tangency here. The demand curve is tangent to the ATC curve, meaning that at the profit maximizing quantity, the firm actually breaks even. There's no way for this firm to earn economic profits. If it reduces its output, let's say down here to Q0, you can see it would be earning economic losses because its ATC would be higher than the price, right there. The ATC is greater than the price. If the firm increased its output to Q2, the same would be true. The firm would be earning economic losses because the ATC is greater than the price. The best a monopolistic competitor can hope to do in the long run is to produce at a level of output where ATC equals price, meaning monopolistic competitors will only break even in the long run. Now, this is just the fate of a monopolistically competitive firm. Of course, if entry barriers are low, anytime economic profits are being earned, those profits will likely be eliminated by the entrance of new firms. But the good news is that if losses were being earned, the barriers to exit are also low. So we could show a situation in which a monopolistic competitor is earning economic losses. If losses are being earned, individual firms would leave the market, increasing the demand for the firms that remain in the market until once again demand is tangent to the average total cost curve, and the firms that have remained are breaking even. Okay, we're going to now clean up our graph and we're going to look very closely at it to determine whether or not efficiency is going to be achieved in monopolistic competition. Okay, here I have redrawn my monopolistic competitor in its long-run equilibrium. How do I know that this firm and this market are in a long-run equilibrium? Well, I can simply draw the profit maximizing quantity, where MC equals MR, and see that at that quantity, demand is tangent to the ATC. In other words, the price that the individual firms can sell their output for is equal to the firm's ATC. There's no reason for firms to enter or exit this market. Each firm is breaking even. There is no additional economic profits that can be earned. Therefore, new firms will not enter. So the next question is, are these firms efficient? We need to look at the graph very carefully to prove that neither allocative nor productive efficiency will be achieved by monopolistically competitive firms in the long run. So the reason for this is that, well, if we look very closely here, we can see that at the quantity that this firm is producing at, that each firm in this market is producing at, the minimum average total cost is not being achieved. So how do I know that? That's because marginal cost equals average total cost at its lowest point. So this right here is where ATC is minimized. In other words, that is the quantity that is productively efficient. I'll call that QPE for the productively efficient quantity. The firm is not achieving its productively efficient quantity. Due to its price-making power, the firm will restrict its output, charge a slightly higher price than the minimum ATC, and therefore it will not be using its resources in the least cost manner. That is our definition of productive efficiency. The next question then is whether or not the firm in the monopolistically competitive market will be allocatively efficient. And to determine this, we must look at demand, which is a signal of marginal benefit. If marginal benefit equals marginal cost at the firm's profit maximizing quantity, then we can say that the firm is allocatively efficient. But let's look closely here. At this quantity, the firm's quantity, we can see that the marginal benefit to society is greater than the marginal cost to the firm. So the firm is not being allocatively efficient. It is restricting its output. It is producing something less than the socially optimal quantity in order to maximize its profits, in this case to break even. The socially optimal quantity, of course, is where marginal cost equals marginal benefit, which is at a slightly greater quantity. So we can put another quantity here and call that QSO, or allocatively efficient quantity. So there you have it. The monopolistic competitor will be neither allocatively nor productively efficient in the long run, simply due to the fact that it has a downward sloping demand curve and a marginal revenue curve that lies below demand. The firm will charge a price higher than its minimum average total cost, and it will be selling at a price that is greater than its own marginal cost, meaning that resources will be underallocated towards monopolistically competitive firms' output, even in the long run, even though the firms will not be earning economic profits in the long run. This should just reiterate the fact that the only perfectly efficient market structure is perfect competition. Only if demand were horizontal could it be tangent to the average total cost curve at its minimum point. So only in perfect competition will firms produce at their minimum ATC in the long run and sell at a price that is equal to their marginal cost in the long run. So that wraps up our lesson on monopolistic competition. This will probably be our only lesson on monopolistic competition. It's a very simple market structure to understand. It shares some characteristics of perfect competition, including a large number of sellers and low barriers to entry. But it also shares some characteristics with monopoly, such as downward sloping demand seen by individual firms, price-making power, and product differentiation. But based on the low barriers to entry that exist, firms in monopolistic competition will only break even in the long run. So there's another characteristic that they share with perfect competitors. Drawing the graph is very tricky. We must be careful to show that demand is tangent to the average total cost curve. Your demand curve cannot cross your ATC curve when showing a monopolistic competitor in its long-run equilibrium. If it did cross the ATC curve, then there would be the possibility of earning economic profits in the long run. But we know that due to the low barriers to entry, that this is.
Hello class, so today we're going to talk about chapter 16, and chapter 16 is monopolistic competition. So we're going to look at certain aspects of monopolistic competition. So we're going to see what structure lies between perfect competition and monopoly and what are their characteristics. So one of them is monopolistic competition, the other one is oligopolies. We're going to see how do monopolistically competitive firms choose their price and quantity, and how do they earn profits, or do they earn any kind of economic profit. We're going to see how does monopolistic competition affect society's welfare, and we're going to look a little bit about the social costs and benefits of advertising. So monopolists, so far we studied the two extremes in market structure, perfect competition and monopoly. So perfect competition had many firms, identical products. Monopoly basically had just one firm. In between these two extremes, we have something called imperfect competition. So one kind of market structure that we will study in the next chapter is oligopoly, which is basically a very few sellers who offer similar or very identical products. And the other kind is monopolistic competition, which is basically firms that they sell very similar products, but they're not identical. So there's some degree of product differentiation between sellers. So what are the characteristics? So the characteristics are many sellers. There is product differentiation. There is free entry and exit. And the examples we have, well, apartment blocks. So there are many sellers, but there are different kinds of product differentiation between apartment blocks. So some apartments have a pool or better gym, or probably will have a washer dryer hookup or even washer dryer installed. So there are different ways apartments try to differentiate themselves. Books, textbooks are pretty much the same thing. Basically, we're using Mankey's textbook here, but there are 10, if not hundreds, there are tens of different authors of principles of economics textbooks. So all those books are monopolistically competitive. Basically, they are teaching the same product. If you pick up a book by Frank Wood and you look at Mankey's book, basically they talk about the same thing, but they try to differentiate based on certain aspects. Probably certain things about the way they explain is slightly different, and that's how they try to do that. Bottled water, clothing, fast food, they're all pretty much the same thing. McDonald's burger and a Burger King burger, I mean, they're pretty similar. They're not exactly the same, so they try to differentiate themselves that way. Same thing goes with nightclubs. So what's the difference? Number of sellers are both many for perfect competition and monopolistic competition. There is free entry and exit. So for most firms, for most industries that are operating in monopolistic competition, you do have free entry and exit. In both cases, since there's free entry and exit, if current firms are earning a profit, then that would encourage firms to enter the market in the future. So in the long run, the economic profits for both perfect competition and monopolistic competition is close to zero. The products they sell are, for perfect competition, they're identical. For monopolistic competition, they're differentiated. So think about it. I mean, a t-shirt from Banana Republic is very similar to a t-shirt from Express or even from Gap, but they are differentiated. Even though Gap and Banana Republic are owned by the same company, even there you have differentiation, slightly differentiated products. So the products they sell have certain qualities that makes them differentiated. If the firm has market power, for perfect competition, no, they don't. For monopolistic competition, they actually create market power. So they create a brand and they make people aware of that brand so that people are more interested to purchase those products. So demand curve facing the firm, yes, there is a market demand curve and an individual demand curve. For the individual firm, in perfect competition, the demand curve is horizontal, but for monopolistic competition, it is downward sloping. The number of sellers, when we compare monopoly and monopolistic competition, there's just one seller in monopoly. There are many sellers in monopolistic competition. There is no free entry and exit in monopoly, but there is in monopolistic competition. As we talked about in the last chapter, monopolies have barriers to entry, but monopolistic competition do not have barriers to entry. Long-run economic profits are positive or zero, or positive for monopoly, but zero for monopolistic competition. In both cases, the firms have market power. In both cases, the firm have a downward sloping demand curve. But for substitutes, for monopoly, there aren't that many substitutes. But for monopolistic competition, there are many substitutes available. So what does a monopolistically firm face in the short run? In the short run, it faces a downward sloping demand curve, just like a monopoly. The marginal revenue curve is also downward sloping, and it's below the demand curve. The marginal cost curve is upward sloping, and the average total cost is U-shaped. So at each quantity, marginal revenue is less than price for the monopolistically competitive firm. And the way it maximizes profit is just the same way as before. It first chooses the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then it finds out, goes up to the demand curve to figure out at what price should it sell the product. So after it determines the price, it checks, okay, what is the average cost of producing the product? So what is the cost per unit of production? And then the profit is basically the area that we see, so the orange rectangle. So in the short run, it could earn profits. In the short run, it could also earn losses. If price is less than average total cost, then we can see that the monopolistically competitive firm might earn losses. It first chooses its price and quantity, and then it figures out whether it's earning a loss or not. So in the short run, it can earn losses, as we saw before, if a firm should shut down or when a firm should exit the market. So in this case, it is earning losses. And probably it's enough losses that doesn't require a complete exit, but it does probably have a shutdown. So for monopolistic competition and monopoly, in the short run, the monopolistic competitive firm and the monopoly they are very similar in behavior. So they earn very similar so they earn, or their profit structure or the way we calculate profit is similar. However, in the long run, because of entry and exit, the economic profit goes to zero. That doesn't happen for monopoly, because a monopoly is the only firm in the market. There are barriers to entry, so it can keep on earning profits in the future. If there is profit in the short run for a monopolistically competitive firm, new firms enter the market, taking demand away from existing firms, so prices and profits fall. If there are losses in the short run, then for a monopolistically competitive firm, some firms exit the market and the remaining firms enjoy higher demand and prices. So in the long run, because of entry and exit, the price that they charge equals to the average total cost. And so the average total cost curve is tangent to the price, or to the point where the price is being chosen. So the average total cost is tangent to the demand curve at the profit maximizing price. So there is a market that it does still charge over that is basically higher than the marginal cost curve. So even though the last unit requires only MC for production, the price it charges is much higher. So why is monopolistically competitive firm less efficient than perfect competition? Well, one, because it has excess capacity. It is not operating at the lowest possible average total cost curve. It produces at a point that is less than cost minimizing. Under perfect competition, the firms produce at a quantity that minimizes the average total cost, but here it doesn't. And there is a markup over marginal cost, even though the last unit requires MC units, MC dollars to produce, the price that the monopolistically competitive firm charges is higher than that. Under perfect competition, price equals marginal cost, so there is a difference there. So even though monopolistically competitive markets do not have all the desirable properties, they do not maximize the welfare to the maximum extent, but they're still better than monopolies. So because price is greater than marginal cost, market quantity is less than socially efficient quantity. However, it is not easy for policymakers to fix the problems. So even though, they are charging a price that is higher than marginal cost, the problem is they're earning zero economic profits in the long run. So you can't really require them to reduce prices, and that would be too much interference of the government in the markets, and so that's probably not desirable. But one thing that does drive up prices or cost for monopolistically competitive industries is because they want to differentiate themselves from other competitors, so they have to use advertising. If you look at firms that advertise, you don't see Farmer Joe advertising his potatoes. You don't see Duke Energy advertising, or you don't even see Boeing advertising their 777. So what you see advertisements of is mainly fast food chains or of clothing companies. So if you go through and look at what companies usually advertise, a lot it's mainly those companies that have a lot of competitors. So in general, the more differentiated the products, the more advertising firms buy. So economists kind of disagree about really what does advertising do to us. So one of the criticism of advertising is we're wasting resources. We're not using that money could have been used to improve the actual quality of the product, but instead we're just using it to basically portray this is what we have, or this is what the product entails. Firms advertise to manipulate people's taste. They don't really add any value. They're just manipulating people's taste. And we have that advertisement or that commercial that we saw on TV that actually encouraged us to become loyal to the brand. And advertising impedes competition. It creates a perception that the products are more differentiated than they really are. Technically, there is really no difference between McDonald's and Burger King burgers, and they're pretty similar, yet through advertisements and through the way they give us the message, they actually create the perception that the products are more differentiated than they really are. Of course, there are some defenders. What it helps, advertisement also provides useful information to buyers. Informed buyers then can make more informed decisions about whether they should purchase the product or not. So in that case, people who support advertising, they believe that advertisement promotes competition and reduces market power. The result of a prominent study that they looked at is that eyeglasses were more expensive in states that prohibited advertising by eyeglass makers than in states that did not restrict those kind of advertising. So advertising does help to bring in more competition. People can make more informed choices, so that can help to reduce prices. That's one side, or that's in defense of advertising. Now we have brand names. In many markets, brand name products coexist with generic ones. Usually firms that have a brand name, and you can always see this, Coca-Cola or Coke products, or products made by Coca-Cola, are slightly more expensive than generic brands. And firms with brand names usually spend more on advertising, charging a higher price for the products. Of course, as in advertising, there is a disagreement whether there should be so much spending on companies to protect or to improve their brand recognition. There are a lot of questions about that. And so this is all we have for monopolistic competition, since it's very similar to Monopoly in the short run, and in the long run, we just have price equal to average total cost. So it's a very short chapter, but it's one of those things that we see a lot around us. So, and next time we are going to talk about oligopolies. Well, have a good rest of the day. I'll see you later.